Welcome, everyone. So, this is another episode of the Baliheart podcast. As you know, I'm Hamish. I'm the guy that's starting to do this podcast. And this is Michel Picard. Is that right?
Michel
Um,
Picard.
who wrote a very interesting book called Kebalian, which is all about kind of Balinese history and what he calls dialogic construction of identity, which is kind of like when you've got one view of something and another view of something. How do you work between them and kind of marry them together? Well, that's sort of my understanding of it. But Michelle, do you want to just introduce yourself and maybe, yeah, just kind of who you are a little bit, and then how you came to write the book and what it was like and stuff like that?
Sure. Well, the book was a long way to go. I first came to Bali after a more or less year-long trip across Asia. I arrived in Bali in April 1974, and I was completely overwhelmed by the beauty of the island, the wealth of the cultural, ritual,
Mm,
artistic expressions, particularly Balinese theater, which was my
mm,
the first interest for me. And after having been away from France for like 2 years, I came back to France. I didn't know what to do. And for some time, I'd been in touch with people studying sociologists studying tourism.
mm,
And then I decided to do a PhD on tourism in Bali.
mm,
And through this PhD, I got recruited by the French National Center for Scientific Research, which allowed me to do research in Bali.
mm,
And since these days, early 1980s, I've been going to Bali at least once a year, sometimes
mm,
twice a year. So over the years, like for 50 years, I spent maybe 8 or 9 years in Bali altogether.
mm,
So I first wrote a book based on my dissertation. So it was mostly on tourism in Bali. It was called, I forgot what it's called. Uh, oh, yes, it was called Cultural Tourism and Touristic Culture,
mm,
which was quite well received.
mm,
And through my interest in the way Balinese were responding to the interest of foreign tourists,
mm, mhm,
I started focusing on the way Balinese reflected on their own identity, particularly cultural identity, which was which had become their main tourism asset.
mm,
And through that, I became aware of the whole history of the construction of the Balinese, the self-reflective Balinese construction of their own identity,
mm,
which they started calling Kebalian. And I
mm,
realized this didn't date from the day the tourists started coming in numbers, but it went all the way back to the 1920s at least, because the 1920s, it's the first time we have written evidence of Balinese elite, social and
mm,
intellectual elite, Balinese who had been educated in colonial schools, started reflecting on what it meant
mm,
to be Balinese. And the way they framed their reflection was in terms of agama and adat,
Mm.
terms which are not Balinese and which are nowadays translated as respectively agama, religion, and adat, tradition.
Mm.
But these terms were not Balinese. So these terms had to be appropriated by Balinese. And during these
Where did they come from?
discussions, well, agama is a Sanskrit loanword, which has a long history. Basically, it's a Shaivite term. The agama are Shaivite theological text going back at least over 2,000 years ago. And we have evidence that the term agama was used in Balinese legal manuals back in Javanese legal manuals back in the 12th century.
Mm.
In those days, agama meant dharma, which is extremely difficult to translate. Dharma is not religion. It's many things. It's tradition. It's basically dharma is what has been transmitted by tradition.
The way that you do things, right? Like
sorry.
the way that you do things.
Yeah, well, it's many things. It has legal denotation. It has to do with rituals, with behavior. I mean, basically, it's untranslatable. It's not it's translatable, right? Back in the early 19th century in India, the first Protestant missionaries, used the word dharma to translate the term religion. And then after several decades, Hindu Indian intellectuals started using the term agama as religion. So they themselves appropriated the term agama in the sense of religion. So it has a long history in India. So basically, the Balinese did more or less the same thing. It's very difficult. We have no evidence of the evolution of the term agama in Indonesia. So, but we know that it was used as dharma from the 12th century onwards, and still in Bali during colonial times. Like in Bali in the 1920s, when the Balinese were starting reflecting on their agama, it meant dharma, okay? But for the Balinese, what dharma meant is very difficult to assess nowadays. So that's one thing. Also, we know that in Malay chronicle from the 14th century, agama meant like din, which is also nowadays translated as religion, which meant many things like dharma. It's not really translatable either. But it was connected with Islam. So we have a parallel evolution of the term agama in Indonesia, according to the people who used it and the language which they used. So between the 12th century and the 20th century, agama meant either dharma or din, according to whether they were Indicized or Islamized. So the Balinese had to deal with that. And for them, it didn't really make sense. They didn't know what really agama meant, but they had pressure from Islamic proselyters and Christian missionaries in terms of religion. So eventually, for them, agama meant what Christian and Muslims meant by agama, that is religion. Okay. So it's a very convoluted story. It's we don't have all the evidence allowing us to know exactly how it evolved. So that's one thing. So the Balinese based their Kebalian, their identity, on one hand on agama, and on the other hand on adat. Adat is an Arabic loanword, so it has strong Islamic connotation, and basically it meant customs that were not based on Islamic creed. So on the one hand, it was valued because it came from the ancestors, the tradition, the way we used to do things. But on the other hand, it was very, the Islamized populations were had an ambivalent view of adat, because on the other hand, it didn't really necessarily fit with Islamic teachings. Okay. So the Balinese were stuck with these two terms. Unfortunately, we don't have evidence on what happened before, how the Balinese came to use these two terms. Why did they say our identity is based on agama and adat, which is what they say in the text that I analyzed back in the 1920s. We don't know what happened before, okay? So that's what we have as evidence. And the Balinese were split basically along social lines, like the nobility, for the nobility, agama and adat were more or less the same things. Like whatever the ritual, the religion was based on the tradition, and they should stick to it. On the other hand, the commoners, or some of them, wanted to dissociate agama from adat, religion from tradition, but they didn't know how to do that. And they admitted that they had no clue how to differentiate between agama and adat.
Why did they want that?
So, because they wanted to have a proper agama, a proper religion, according to the idea of religion based on what they knew of Islam and about Christianity. And they were under pressure. A lot of school teachers were Muslims. And so the Balinese were aware that around them, there were people who had a proper religion, mostly Islam, mostly Muslims. And on the other hand, back starting in the early 1930s, there were a trickle of Christian missionaries, mostly Protestants, but also after that, after a few years, also Catholics. So all this pressure meant that for the more progressive Balinese commoners, religion was defined in terms of Islam and Christianity. So they were aware that they didn't have a proper religion, and they thought that to be civilized, to be proper, they needed to have a proper religion. So that's why they decided that they had to differentiate between agama as a proper religion and adat as just tradition, the way we used to do things. And that went for some time. And then in the 1930s, for various reasons, the Orientalist view of that stressed the wealth of Balinese culture, and also because tourism was developing back in the 1930s and focusing on the ceremonies, on the artistic expression of the Balinese added the term budaya as culture to the definition of their identity. Budaya being also a non-Balinese term. Budaya is based on Sanskrit through Malay, and also all these discussions among the Balinese were not held in Balinese, in their own language, but in a foreign language, which was Malay, which was the vehicular language in the archipelago, as opposed to their own language, the Balinese. And Balinese and Malay, which became Indonesian, are two different languages, okay? So that's a very odd situation. They discussed, they wanted to understand who they were, but using an alien, a foreign, like linguistic vehicle. So that's quite a problem to start with. Okay, so basically, through the lead that I started to investigate when I worked on Balinese tourism, I became aware of that construction of Balinese identity in terms of agama, adat, and budaya. Okay, and over the years, actually, I should say over the decades, because I started having these ideas back in the late 1980s. Okay, so that's a very long process for me. Then I thought that the most interesting, the red thread through that construction was the agama, was religion, more than adat or budaya. And when the Balinese became Indonesian citizens, the Indonesian Ministry of Religion forced them, or actually did not recognize whatever Balinese religion was as a proper religion. So they needed to have a proper religion in those days, meaning either Islam or the two varieties of Christianity. Reformed or Catholic.
I remember from the book that whole drama with, there was like a government department and then like a sub thingy, and they were arguing about like, one wanted Balinese religion to be recognized as a real religion, and then the other one, and there was almost like they were trying to cut each other off, like destroy each other and all of that stuff.
Yeah, well, they debated on that for between 1950 and 1958. So it took them a long time, lobbying, pressure, including political pressure. So they had to agree among themselves. And in 1952, the Balinese intellectual, religious, political leaders basically agreed on calling their religion, agama, Hindu Bali. So it was Hindu, all right, but it was specifically Balinese. It was unlike Hinduism in India. Meanwhile, there were a very few young Balinese studying in Indian universities, and becoming acquainted with Hinduism, Indian Hinduism, and bringing back the good words from Indian Hinduism to the fellow co-religionists back in Bali. So over the years, back in 52, they agreed on agama Hindu Bali. So they put pressure on the Ministry of Religion, and eventually, and thanks to the backing of Sukarno, whose mother was a Balinese, the agama Hindu Bali was acknowledged by the Ministry of Religion back in 1958. Then the Balinese had to decide how the Hindu Balinese religion was to be organized, institutionalized, and in 59 they created what they call a Council of Balinese Hinduism, if you want, called the Parisada Dharma Hindu Bali. So acknowledging that the religion was specifically Balinese,
And
was
I feel
Hindu Balinese.
and I feel like a lot of these things, the adoption of like an appropriation of terms, and then the organizing of a council, and all these things,
Right.
but before all of the pressure from the outside, Balinese language didn't sort of overthink things a lot. Everything was a lot of verbs. You just did stuff, and it was a very embodied experience. And they just started to need to build all of these things in order to defend themselves from all of these forces coming at them from different directions.
Yes, they had to defend themselves.
Yeah,
But by defending themselves, they transformed
yeah, fully.
deliberately in many ways. I mean, mostly
They
deliberately,
had
they
like you just kind of
transformed
they
their
just kind of had
identity.
to, right? Yeah,
Yeah, well, they had to invent something
yeah,
which didn't exist.
yeah,
I mean, in my understanding, the notion of religion did not make sense for
yeah,
the Balinese
yeah,
back in the 1920s. They had no notion of something which should be distinguished from their own social life. I mean, they had rituals, plenty of rituals. They had obligations, but they didn't belong to a concept called religion.
mm,
So they had to really make sense of that new idea
mm,
brought about mostly by the Dutch colonizers,
mm,
the Muslim school teachers, and the Christian missionaries. Okay,
mm,
so then in the 1950s, they had more or less appropriated the idea of religion, and they had to compose what the religion was about, and that took several years, and then they came out with something like a Bible called the Panchashada, the 5 basic beliefs
mm,
of Balinese religion, which don't have any equivalent in India, except that it mostly inspired by the Arya Samaj, which was a reformed movement created in 1875 in India. So it's part of what the Indologists called neo-Hinduism, which is very unlike
yeah,
traditional
yeah,
Hinduism as actually practiced by Hindu in India, which was a reformed, universalized notion of a Hindu world religion. Okay, so the Balinese were inspired by that through the students who had studied Hinduism in universities, particularly the university. I forgot the name of it in by. Anyway, I forgot the. It's a specific university opened in Bengal by Indian reformers.
mm,
So after a while, the fact that Balinese started emigrating in various parts of Indonesia, expanding the network, in Balinese students who had been studying in India were back in Bali, and they decided to universalize the name of the council. So instead of Parisada Dharma Hindu Bali, they decided to call it Parisada Hindu Dharma. The idea of Hindu Dharma, which is an Indian term, being this new neo-Hinduism as a universal religion. So they thought it would reinforce, it would strengthen the institutional position to have a Parisada Hindu Dharma as opposed to a specifically Parisada Dharma Hindu Bali. So
and
that happened in 1964, during the first Congress of the Council, they officially changed the name.
Yeah.
Okay. Then the next step was in 1986, when the Parisada Hindu Dharma became the Parisada Hindu Dharma Indonesia. Because in the meantime, after the birth of the so-called New Order and the President Suharto becoming president of Indonesia, and after the slaughter of so-called Indonesian communists, it became really a matter of life or death to have a proper acknowledged official religion. And so quite a few Javanese nominal Muslims, the so-called Abangan, decided that they didn't want to have anything to do with Islam, and they started converting either to Christianity or to Hinduism or to Buddhism, which had in the meantime been acknowledged as a proper religion as well, as a monotheism, which for Buddhism, it's even more bizarre than for Hinduism. So they were non-Balinese who had become Hindu. Also, more or less at the same time, the Balinese Hindu were more and more influenced by the so-called neo-Hindu movement, so-called Sampradaya, mostly Sai Baba and Hare Krishna, who started coming to Bali and convert the Balinese to their new movement. So there has been, since 1980, there's been a tension between the Balinization of Indonesian Hindus who didn't want to become Balinese, but they had converted to Hinduism as a shield against the Islam or Christianity. They didn't want to become Muslim or Christian, so they converted to Hinduism. But they were not Balinese, and they had nothing to do with Balinese rituals, they said. And on the other hand, there was the movement to universalize Balinese rituals. So that created a tension between the Balinization of Indonesian Hindus and the universalization of Balinese rituals. And that tension affected the Parisada Hindu Dharma, and that was the main reason of the change of name of Parisada Hindu Dharma becoming Parisada Hindu Dharma Indonesia, to include all these different groups. So Parisada was becoming more and more heterogeneous. And then 10 years later, in 1996, due to the pressure of non-Balinese Hindus, the Parisada Hindu Dharma Indonesian was moved from Bali to Jakarta. And that increased the split between those Balinese who wanted to keep their Balinese ritual traditions and the Indonesian Hindus who wanted to cut off the link between Indonesian Hinduism, Agama Hindu, and the Balinese rituals. So eventually, after Suharto has to step out in 1998, and the so-called Reformasi, the reform movement, which opened the political and religious game, the Balinese the Balinese had their own, the Parisada Hindu Dharma Indonesia had their own congress in 2001. And at that time, there was an official split between the two fractions of the Balinese Parisada. One was actually the Balinese Parisada split from the national Parisada, and they formed their own Balinese Parisada. And then the national Parisada named a new fraction of the Balinese Parisada. So there was that in 2002, there were two competing Balinese Parisada. Ones which wanted to stick to their own Balinese traditions, and the other one who wanted to have a universal Hinduism. And that went on until 2007, when the Balinese Parisada, the split fraction, decided to go back officially to the initial title of the Parisada, which was Parisada Dharma Hindu Bali. And in the same movement, they went back to Agama Hindu Bali, acknowledging that the Balinese religion came from Majapahit and not from India. So the split was really consumed. There was really there were two splitting fraction of Balinese Parisada. Over the years, this split was sort of smoothed, even that the tension was never resolved. Nevertheless, back in the 2000, they were more the Parisada was more and more worried about conversions of Hindu Balinese to both Islam and Christianity. And in 2011, the head of the National Parisada connected with the head of an international Hindu organization.
Sorry, we had to just take a short break because I have a chest infection and needed to clear my throat. But also, just from everything that you've been saying, Michel, that, it's really inspiring to me. Number one, like just the work that you did, and the scope. Like, I really admire the work that you did over decades, pulling this grand kind of thesis together of all, through all this stuff. And, and the other thing is how much I admire the Balinese themselves through listening to this story, because it's like they were in a pressure cooker for the last 150 years, basically, with all these just forces just coming at them from every direction, pretty much. And nevertheless, I had this image of like a tightrope walker with, only 1 foot on the rope and a bar and like five dishes balanced on each side and 5 dishes balanced on 1 foot.
Yeah,
and
that's a good image.
And they didn't even have words for stuff, and they just had to make it up as they went along and do their best. But nevertheless, that they've survived. I feel like they've evaded a full scale kind of religious conversion at any point. They've evaded the worst impacts of cultural destruction by engaging so just balls to the wall, really, like with that process of just trying to always like pulling something in from neo-Hinduism or pulling something in from Islam if they need to, or pulling something in from Christianity. Whatever they needed to do, they just figured out what they needed to do and they did it. And the result is, Bali's no perfect country right now, but like it's pretty like well preserved in terms of like culture, well-being, and that's what I see anyway. So
Uh-huh,
I
uh-huh.
just thought it would be good to sort of pull out, and also just from everything that you're saying, I feel like that I can see now more strongly the connections between the people that I want to go and interview and spotlight in different episodes and kind of their struggles and their process and the historical struggles of all those people, like the two different versions of that one Parisada, is it? Um,
Yeah.
and both of like their ideas about what's the best way to go here. Is it universalizing Hinduism or is it, what's the other thing? I don't know. But that they're both valid ideas and they both, go into bat for that idea. And there's always these like multiple streams, kind of if you look at time going up this way, there's always these multiple streams working against each other, sometimes working with each other. And the result is, you end up with a pretty still workable situation here. I mean, it's not without its problems, but I think they've done a magnificent job of being in a pressure cooker for 150 years and not being steamrolled at any, like fully steamrolled at any point.
Yeah, you got a point. Yeah.
Mm,
Maybe I could add I could add two recent development. I mean,
mm,
up to 2020. Okay, as I said, they in 1990s and after the 1990s, the Balinese Hindus were worried that there were more and more conversions of Balinese Hindus to either Islam or Christianity.
mm,
And the Parisada was criticized by lots of Balinese Hindus and Indonesian Hindus in general for not being proactive enough and not protecting the Balinese Hindus enough
mm,
from proselytizing from Christian or Muslim quarters. Okay, so in 2011, the head of the Parisada went to India to connect with the leadership of the so-called World Hindu Federations, which was more or less which is a universe which would like to be a universal institution for all Hindus all over the world
mm,
and in defense of Hinduism as a world religion.
mm,
Okay. And in 2012, they decided to have an international congress in Bali of the World Hindu Federations with lots of representatives of all sorts of Hindu organizations in India and from other other parts of the world in Bali under the patronage of the president of Indonesia. I mean, it was really upscale event.
mm,
Unfortunately, I wasn't there to attend the event, but they decided to create a World Hindu Parisad, which should be a World Hindu Federation to protect and defend Hinduism, not only in Bali, not only Indonesia, but the world over.
mm,
But the Balinese head, the head of the Parisada, who has always been a Balinese, was to be the head of the World Hindu Parisad.
mm,
Then in the following years, they had yearly meetings, international events, which I attended, to discuss various problems of facing the Hindus the world over. And then, as usual, in Bali and probably Indonesia, after a few years, the enthusiasm just vanished. And nowadays, the world into Parisad seems to be completely dead. Meanwhile, it had been
it's a bit like
criticized.
the UN. It's a bit like the UN of Hinduism.
Sorry,
It's a bit like
I didn't get that. Sorry.
It's a bit like the UN of Hinduism, like gotten
Yes,
so big that it's
actually
kind
it was a counterpart of the I forgot how it's called, the Islamic World Organization. It's not the exact title, but there is the Islamic equivalent.
yeah.
So the Balinese who had initiated that move, and that I interviewed them, explained that they needed an international protection from Islamic pressure, which had increased for Islamic and Christian, which had increased since the new regime, 1998, the so-called Reformatie.
And I think, like, for me, this is helping me tease out another really important theme that I want to keep exploring, which is kind of mono versus poly. And like, you know, if you go back far enough, most belief systems the world over were animistic and polytheistic. And then, you know, as time went on, kind of along with the centralization of like from villages to towns to government to cities to nations, you also got like monoizing. Like we have, I think in the West we have like monocultures now, where there's one way to have relationships, there's one God in Christianity, so on and so forth, and it's really it's actually really damaging to everybody that doesn't fit into that mono.
I fully agree.
And like for example, when I was catching a taxi to Kuliki in north of Ubud to stay there for a week just recently, we had to pull over because there was a procession from Kuliki to the next town down there. And it's about 3,000 people. There's probably 90% of the population of Kuliki on the road, walking, taking their gods from that village to the next village. And that's because, this village's religion is not exactly the same as that village's religion. But we still need to have social cohesion between those two villages. We'll go for a cup of tea. We'll take our gods for a cup of tea with your gods. And we don't have to monoize anything. We just need to have a cup of tea with each other once in a while to keep everyone on a good, even keel kind of thing. And if you look at it in the West, that we're starting to recover, and we've got like lip service to diversity and inclusion, but like we're still pretty awful at it, to be honest. Like as a neurodiverse person myself, I've experienced the not so nice side of how we're not very good at inclusion and diversity, and that's something that personally, on a personal level, I've experienced belonging and acceptance in Bali because they've defended their diversity so well from that mono steamrolling force. Like I've met a number of transgender people here, and one of them's a woman who owns a business with 3 staff. Like back in Bandung, where she's from, completely impossible for that to happen. The level of inflammatory discrimination she would have experienced, she would have never been able to start a business. But because it's here, and that true that true inclusion and diversity and flexibility is alive. Yeah, that's something again I want to like really bring out.
Yes, it works to some extent better in Bali than in other parts of Indonesia, as far as I can
Well, that's
tell.
that's
But
right. That's right. I mean, and
yeah, yeah,
the way that Bali was, it was also, that last vestige of the Mahapajit kind of Hindu, so it's got certain real differences to everything else around it.
yeah, to a certain extent. But if I may finish my story,
Yeah.
the latest event I'm aware of go back to around 2020, and it reveals that the tension, which was meant to be smoothed over by the World Hindu Parishad,
Mm,
had not really worked, as there were movements in Bali, in various parts of Bali, particularly in Denpasar, of I mean, there were pressure of various Balinese communities against the so-called Sampradaya, the neo-Hindu movements,
mm,
particularly Hare Krishna, up to the point that these Balinese, who were more or less on the side of the Agama Hindu Bali against the neo-Hinduism, universal neo-Hinduism, these Balinese managed to have the national Parisada backing the pressure and having the Hare Krishna banned. And the Hare Krishna now, since 2020, are not allowed to have ceremonies in Balinese villages. So I don't know the details because I wasn't on the spot to investigate. So my information came from various sources,
mm,
written sources, reading the newspapers online and so on and so on. But whereas the main trend was toward universalization of Hinduism in Bali,
mm,
seemed to be reversed, with the Parisada endorsing a re-Bali Hinduization as opposed to universal Hinduization. But that's a speculation because I don't know the following story, right? There were 5 years happening since then, and I've no information on what's going on.
because Hindu,
But just to tell that the story is not completely written, that it's
yeah,
not over. The tension between those Balinese who want to stick to the traditional rituals, even though they're changing by sticking to Agama Hindu Bali is an invention. So people who want to stick to Agama Hindu Bali actually have invented a new tradition,
mm,
which they oppose to the trend and the influence of the neo-Hindu movements
mm,
coming straight from India and working on transforming really radically the Balinese traditional ritual. So the tension is still
mm.
going on.
And I mean, like something that I picked up from your book because in your book it sort of the book's narrative spends some time in India, like when it's talking about how Hinduism itself is again, it's not it's a it's a Western academic imposed term on a wide variety of, a whole gamut of kind of
Yeah,
beliefs,
sure, true,
indigenous,
of course.
diverse beliefs that sort of,
Yeah,
gradually change as you traverse the
of
landscape
course, of course.
of India. But yeah, again, just this
That's
kind
all.
of,
That's all, excuse me. That's also how I got interested in the Hinduization of so-called Balinese religion. It's
Mm,
because in the meantime, I've been to India quite a lot of time,
mm,
and in the meantime, I've read a lot of books on so-called Hinduism and the historiography of the denomination Hinduism, which was invented by a British missionary back in 1768 or 1770. I forgot the exact date, but the terms Hinduism is a British invention,
mm,
and then it was adapted by the first Hindu reformer, uh, whose name I can't think of now, uh, in 1816. Okay, so in 1816, a Hindu reformer writing in English appropriated the term Hinduism to name what we Hindu were doing. We're
mm,
doing Hinduism.
mm,
So it took about like 40 years or 50 years for the term to go from a British missionary to a Hindu reformer.
mm,
So yeah, the construction of Hinduism is as fascinating in many
mm,
ways as the construction of Balinese Hinduism, and it goes more or less in parallel ways.
mm,
And that's also that helped me follow the thread of what happened in Bali, having read, because what I investigated in Bali has not been really researched before me, whereas what happened in Indian Hinduism has been thoroughly researched. I mean, there are dozens of books on that topic.
mm. Yeah, for me, I'm really interested in that again, that force of um, in so for Hinduism in India, they were experiencing a force of monoization from
Yeah,
a poly situation, um,
sure.
and I think because I guess that my underlying agenda, if you like, if I think about it now,
Yeah.
it's good to talk this stuff through because lots of things come up. Is my experience of the destructiveness of monoculture in my own life, and experiencing a culture which has resisted that really effectively, and then thinking about what would that look like if less of that monoculture, if more of that polyculture, um, more societies and communities could take advantage of more of that polyculture, because there's always a centralizing
Yeah.
instinct,
Yeah.
but when you can balance that with keeping that diversity and that and the live and let liveness of and but still with social cohesion, people still talking to
Uh-huh.
each
Uh-huh.
other about their differences. um yeah, because that's been my work in community development for years,
Yeah.
and
And
seeing the
obvious.
failures of
Yeah.
that. So
Mm.
that's kind of why I'm so interested in this topic now.
Yeah, and coming from New Zealand, I mean, you obviously you have a feeling for the indigenous community. I
Yeah,
mean, the Maoris
yeah,
in your own country.
yeah.
That's you mentioned that somewhere. I mean, or
And
in
yeah, and I think within their own, like, I mean, if I compare, because Maori fought really hard, like literally with muskets and
so did the
foxholes.
Balinese. So did
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Balinese.
yeah. Um, and we've got the treaty, but nevertheless, the way that Maori would just really put down hard to the
Uh,
point that you could get whacked for speaking a word of Maori in class, in the early 20th century type of thing. Um,
right.
so it was a real full suppression mode. Yeah, and it's coming back now. but I notice also
Yeah.
Māori are kind of like battening down the hatches a little bit, and
Hmm.
like creating cultural safety in their own bubble. Um,
Yeah.
but it's interesting to compare with Bali, where it seems like the boundaries are still more porous, where a weirdo
Right.
like me can still kind of make friends and have experiences and benefit from things. Mm,
Yeah, true.
mm. Well, maybe is there anything else you'd like to add? Just to sort of,
Not that I can think of.
yeah, I I feel like we're kind of landing in a really good place, and it's just under an hour too. So there you go. So yeah, I'd just like to again underline how much I admire your work, like the reading the book,
Thank you.
like it's one of, because I'd had this experience in Bali, but I couldn't really make sense of it. And then the book really just tied everything together. So, and this just how you spend decades, on that sense making process is just incredible, and the rigor that you put into that. So I really admire it, and thank you for that. And thank you for taking the
Well, thank
time
you.
to talk to me today as well.
Yeah.